My name is Aleem, and alongside my teammates Patrick and Brad, today we're going to present to you the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 6th edition. So in our presentation today, we'll be going through an introduction, a historical context, analysis, a conclusion, as well as our forum questions. So jumping right into it, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the IPCC is first. And the overall goal of the IPCC was that it was created to provide policymakers with scientific assessments on climate change, its implications, as well as potential future risks. And so with this research and data, the organization puts forward adaptation and mitigation policies in order to combat climate change and present policymakers with science and data behind potential implications from the increasing threat of global warming. And so the organization operates kind of on a three-pronged approach, and they separate these into different working groups. So working group 1 is focused on the physical science basis of climate change. Working group 2 is focused on climate change's impacts, the adaptations and vulnerability, and then working group 3 is focused on the mitigation of climate change. So now, before we go more in depth on IPCC and the specifics of this report, it's important to understand the historical context that makes this report so relevant. So the first, key historical event related to climate change, particularly from a policy perspective, was the first World Climate Conference in Geneva. And this climate conference issued a declaration calling on the world's governments to foresee and prevent potential man-made changes in climate. And so from this first event, this kind of spurred a series of subsequent events, and I'll outline kind of the key ones that we've seen since this first World Climate Conference. So shortly after this World Climate Conference, there was a lot of talk about the ozone layer and the damages humans were causing to the ozone layer, which resulted in 1987 the signing of the Montreal Protocol. And this is a multilateral agreement that regulates the production and consumption of man-made chemicals to protect the ozone layer. And it's interesting because this problem became so large in the past that this is the only UN treaty that's been ratified by every member. In fact, during this time, there was television ads, TV specials on the concerns related to the ozone layer, and this was a really significant problem. And from this was the creation of IPCC, and this was created by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program. And the objective of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is to provide governments at all levels with scientific information they can use to develop climate policies. And so shortly after this, we had the signing of the Kyoto Protocol, and this kind of operationalized the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by committing industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gases and emissions. And so from this Kyoto Protocol, we had lots of developments in terms of making tangible commitments. And this was kind of emphasized and further taken and specified by the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where countries met and accomplished new outcomes, including a multilateral climate change agreement that focused on limiting emissions to well below 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, I believe that number is 1.5 degrees. And so since this Paris Climate Change Agreement, there's been significantly increased talks on reducing the impacts that climate change can have. And most recently, we saw the COP26 summit, which accomplished certain things like methane gas pollution reduction and deforestation, and preventing even coal financing. However, many experts were sort of disappointed with the outcome of the COP26 summit in Glasgow and think that there needs to be even further progress to climate change. And this is really reinforced by the report we're going to be talking about today, which is the IPCC AR6, so the 6th edition climate report, which focuses on narrowing down the solutions across all of these working groups to how we can better combat climate change moving forward. So through this historical overview, we can kind of come to this understanding of how policy is implemented. So first we have research papers from organizations such as IPCC, which would be considered sort of that leading research center that provides organizations and governments with information that they need to make policy. And so what we'll see kind of in this cycle is that we'll have research papers come out, people become aware, and media coverage, is very apparent these days on climate change-related papers. And this pushes policymakers to hold climate conferences and commit to new emissions targets and policies. And so through this cycle, we should have some sort of global collaboration resulting in collective action. And so, kind of diving deeper into IPCC AR6, this report really aims to address three main things. Firstly, it integrates the interdependence of climate ecosystems and biodiversity within human societies. Secondly, it outlines issues beyond climate change, including biodiversity loss, unsustainable consumption. And thirdly, it uses scientific methods in order to present these key findings. And so, compared to past reports, IPCC AR6 focuses on solutions across all working groups with more regional information and more integration, across these groups. And so, I guess, one of the key findings and one of the most concerning findings of this report is that the world will probably reach 1.5 degrees of global warming within the next 2 decades, which is extremely concerning. In the Paris Climate Agreement, countries signed on to hold global warming to below 1.5 degrees, through all of time. And so this is definitely a very concerning finding of this report.
So now let's take a closer look at the IPCC and what exactly it's trying to tell us. So the first thing it's trying to tell us is that climate change, in generating all of its associated hazards, risks, and vulnerabilities, can generate impacts that surpass our ability to effectively adapt, and hence they result in economic losses and damages to our economies. The second thing is climate change does not only cause global warming, it also causes biodiversity loss, unsustainable consumption of natural resources, land and ecosystem degradation, human demographic shifts, socioeconomic inequalities, and more. It even impacts our human systems like infrastructure, urban planning, supply chains, food production, human health and well-being, and socioeconomic distribution in vulnerable regions. And this climate change causes environmental ecosystem degradation, which reciprocally causes further climate change and global warming, such as through wildfires, droughts, and flooding, than what would otherwise have been prevented by these ecosystems that were just lost due to climate change. For example, a forest might have been burned down by the ever-growing number of wildfires taking place because of climate change, and this destruction of the forest released even more global warming, creating more wildfires in the future. And lastly, meeting the objectives of climate-resilient development supports our human, ecosystem, and planetary health, as well as human well-being. But this requires our society and ecosystems to move towards a more resilient state. One of the major key findings of the IPCC is that humans should pursue climate actions that are high in climate justice. This includes distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition. Distributive justice is the allocation of costs and benefits to individuals, nations, and generations. Procedural justice is addressing who gets to participate in the decision-making process towards climate change. And recognition is the basic respect and engagement with diverse cultures and perspectives. For example, giving Indigenous people a voice and allowing them to speak when it comes to climate change. We also have several reference periods that are referenced throughout the IPCC. The first is the historical climate reference period. This is from 1850 to 1900, so before climate change really occurred, before the industrial era. And then we also have future climate reference periods, and this is the near term, midterm, and long term. The near term is 2021 to 2040, and that's where we're really trying to keep below 1.5 degrees. Right now, we're at 1.09. And there's about a greater than 50% chance we do in fact surpass 1.5 degrees by 2040. So that's what the IPCC is really trying to get us to avoid. We also have midterm implications from 2041 to 2060, as well as long-term from 2081 to 2100. The IPCC outlines three main summaries for policymakers, and they describe the impacts climate change can have on current and future human and natural systems, as well as the adaptations and mitigations that can be taken to improve human and planetary resilience to climate change. Now, these three key summaries are observed and projected impacts of climate change, adaptation measures, and climate resilient development. So the first main summary that the IPCC represents is the observed and projected impacts of climate change. Now, widespread, pervasive impacts to ecosystems, people, settlements, and infrastructure have resulted from our impact, human-induced, on climate through the increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather events on both the land and in the ocean. Some examples of the impacts of climate change are heavy precipitation, tropical cyclones, drought, drought-related tree mortality, wildfires, heat-related mortality, coral bleaching, food and water insecurity, reduced productivity outputs, greater socioeconomic inequalities, greater vector-borne diseases, and reduced physical and mental health. Now, industry sectors that are particularly vulnerable to climate change are agriculture, forestry, fishery, energy, tourism, as well as infrastructure development and economic growth that's in coastal city regions and small islands. Now, population social inequalities that can increase one's vulnerability to climate change are gender, income, location, disability, indigenous culture, and minority status. And as seen in the graph, global aggregate net economic damages generally will increase non-linearly with global warming levels. So if they continue to accelerate the amount of global warming, the negative impacts that this will cause on the world in terms of our economic losses will get more and more severe. The second main summary that the IPCC outlines is adaptation measures to climate change. Adaptation is reducing climate risks and vulnerabilities through the adaptation of our current systems. In the last couple of decades, we've actually observed great progress in our adaptation planning and implementation across all of our major sectors. At least 170 countries have now begun including adaptation in their climate policies as the public and political awareness of climate change's risks and impacts continues to grow. And adaptation can generate multiple benefits in addition to reducing climate risks and economic damages. For example, agricultural productivity can be improved, innovation, health, well-being, food security, livelihood, and biodiversity conservation. So there's been continued progress in adaptation, and this is especially true amongst water-related risks in these coastal cities and islands, where they've had to pursue adaptation to stop the increasingly prevalent sea level rise. However, many adaptation measures do prioritize near-term reductions, but they often ignore the longer-term reductions, at least to date, so more focus needs to be paid on that in the future. But adaptations come with certain limits as well. For example, they have significant financial constraints. They're very expensive. And there's a constant trade-off between adaptation and mitigation because they both cost a lot of money to pursue. And there's very prevalent inequities and poverty at play here as well, because adaptation is most necessary in some of the most vulnerable areas, but those also tend to be some of the poorest as well. The third main summary that the IPCC outlines is climate resilient development. Climate resilient development integrates adaptation measures with mitigation measures that enhance sustainability for all, including both human systems and ecosystems. That means instead of making trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation, climate resilient development, or CRD, is able to integrate these two and create synergies between them. However, opportunities to implement climate resilient development are not equally distributed around the world, and the most vulnerable climate-prone regions often have the most difficulty with actually implementing them. However, with that said, climate resilient development implementation can be made much easier if we have political leadership, institutions, and their climate services that have access to the resources, information, and support that they need. As well, Governments, society, and the private sector should prioritize climate risk reduction, as well as environmental equity and justice. There also needs to be effective international cooperation, such as between various educational, scientific, and institutional bodies. And notice in the graph on the right that to implement climate resilient development, our cumulative social choices we make around the globe will slowly start to shift us either more towards or more away from our sustainability goals, either moving us closer to the green or the red over time. And that's why it's so important that humanity starts as soon as possible with pursuing climate resilient development.
Now that Liam and Patrick have walked you through our analysis of this report, I'm going to tie in some of our findings into concepts that we've learned throughout this course. Firstly, let's look at environmental standards. It is evident that there's an ongoing climate emergency. Now, using class concepts, we can highlight the three environmental standards: efficiency, safety, and sustainability. Given the findings of the report, the impacts of climate change affect all three of these standards. Firstly, let's look at sustainability. Widespread pervasive impacts to ecosystems, people, and infrastructure. Now, obviously, if the climate continues to deteriorate, economic sustainability is going to be negatively affected. Secondly, we have safety standards. Certain industries and groups of populations are particularly vulnerable. Some of these groups include islands, low income, coastal areas, and people living near the poles. The issue is that these groups do not have the financing, resources, or governance structures to be able to implement the adaptation that they need in order to deal with these problems. And finally, the last environmental standard is efficiency. And this is simply that the economic costs increase in a non-linear manner with global warming levels. Now, the second course concept surrounds the idea of whether more is better. Now, in class, we learned that if humans act on the assumption that more is better, they tend to operate under the rat race prisoner's dilemma, which implies that people need to work more and earn more in order to keep up with society. Now, comparing this with our report, what we find is that given the dominant strategy is to engage in a rat race, adaptation becomes particularly difficult. Climate change policies and guidelines can hinder corporation profits, which can result in the rat race prisoner's dilemma to continue. And finally, the last course concept is biocentrism. Now, we talked in class about the idea of biocentrism and how it is the moral responsibility of each person to treat the world with respect. From the findings in the report, if we can find an integration between adaptation and mitigation, it can potentially result in environmental synergies, and thus we can pursue development initiatives but through a climate-friendly framework. Now, to summarize all these implications and course concepts, it is evident that there's an ongoing climate emergency, and using course concepts as well as findings from the IPCC report, we can clearly demonstrate economic concepts suggest to adhere to the policy suggestions of the report itself. Now, to finish up the core presentation, we have a conclusion, which highlights the main findings as well as a concluding statement. Now, in terms of our main findings, we have three main points. The first is adaptation and mitigation. And this just highlights that there is a necessity to merge adaptation and mitigation through creating climate-resilient development actions. The second main finding is that the temperature reduction goals. And this is that humanity should strive to keep below 1.5 degrees, at least in the near term, which we define as by 2040. And finally, one of our main findings surrounds human systems and natural ecosystems. And this is just that increased global warming will make the adaptation resilience to climate change increasingly more difficult. Now, the final concluding statement that we have is that humans are unequivocally causing global warming, and we must immediately act through stringent policy measures in order to enforce collaboration between all UN member nations to adapt, mitigate, and overcome climate change. That's the end of our presentation, and now I'm going to go into the Packback questions for this week. Now, in terms of this week's forum questions, the first question that we have is that one of the key suggestions of the IPCC AR6 is to pursue climate resilient development. This framework is a process for adapting and mitigating climate change impacts when planning future development initiatives. Can you think of a potential policy or example where climate resilient development has been considered? And the second weekly forum question that we have is that in class we discussed the three environmental standards: efficiency, safety, and sustainability. IPCC's AR6 report observed and projected the following impacts of climate change. First, widespread pervasive impacts to ecosystems, people, and infrastructure. Second, certain industries and groups of populations are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And thirdly, economic costs increase non-linearly with global warming levels. So, based on this information, do you feel one sustainability standard will become more important moving forward? And if so, why? That's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it, and have a great rest of your day.